In this video, we are going to create a Mule API to get the flight information. So to create the Mule API, let's start defining the API specification. So first we will create a RAMl API specification and define input and output parameters. And once we create the API specification, we'll import it to Anypoint Studio and create a Mule project. And we'll see how to use HTTP and DB connectors, and also we'll use scatter gather component. And we'll do the response mapping using Dataweave too. And once we create the API, we will deploy the application using jar from runtime manager. So as a prerequisite, we need to have an account with Anypoint platform. So you can use your email address and basic information and create an account. We need Anypoint Studio to create the Mule project and basic understanding of REST API and OOPS concept. And in this video, we are going to create a Mule API to get the flight information. So we will have a request, and as a response, we will get flight information. In the request, there will be origin, destination, and departure date. And based on these parameters, we should get the flight information. So based on origin, destination, from where to where and what date the flight is departing, on those information we should be able to get the flight information along with the booking numbers. So in the response we have flight information. It's a get API, get flights API, and flight will have the flight information, and PNR array will have the booking information for each flight. So the flight information can come from a REST API, and the booking information can come from the database. So we have to get these information and consolidate together and build the response. And once we develop the API, it should look something like this. Flights will be the resource, so where the consumer can expect the flight information, the array of flight information. So we have list of query parameters, origin, destination, and departure date. So in case of success workflow, we will get flight information, the array of flight information. So each item in the array will have a flight to indicate the flight number, departure date, time, arrival date, arrival time, so on, along with the booking information. Now let's create the API specification. So we will need an account with the Anypoint platform. I have our account details. I have username and password details. If you don't have, you can sign up and create an account with Anypoint platform. It is free for 30 days, and after that you can reuse the same Gmail with a different username. So now let's go to Design Center. Let's create a new API specification. We have two options here. Using the first option, we can create the API specification on our own by using text editor. And with the second option, we can create the API specification by using a visual editor. So let's name the API specification. It's a flights experience API. So currently we are in the Design Center text editor, where we can add the API specification, and the right side we have documentation section, and based on what API specification we define, we get the documentation created. So we have a list of request parameters and also response information. So get is the HTTP method and flights is the resource. So for better understanding, let's remove the existing host and just get the information that we need to create the API specification. So here we have a list of query parameters. Get is the HTTP method, flights is the resource, and we also have a response. So now let's start creating the API specification. /flights, flights is the resource. So user will get the flights information. So get is a HTTP method, and let's add some description. And in the right side documentation section, you can see that based on the specifications that we are defining, the documentation will be created. This API will get the list of flights with booking information. So resource we have defined and HTTP method, and let's start with query parameters. We have origin and the type of the field is string. So this field accept string information. Let's give the example that matches the data type. The example that we are giving here should match the type that we have given above. It should be string. If you give number or some other data type, it fails, because there will be a validation based on the type we are giving. So example should match the data type. We have another parameter called destination, and again the type is string. And let's add some example. And we have departure date. Departure date is also a string field, and let's copy the example. If you want to define the constraint for these fields, you can add the minimum length, maximum length, or the pattern. Based on your requirement, you can do the validations. You can add the validation for the parameters. And let's go inside the API, get flights API. Here we can see that we have the query parameters added. And now let's add the response. 200 success response body, and the response will be in the form of JSON. So let's add some description for the response that we get. So we get the list of flights. And this is the response that we get. We get the array of flight information, right? We have a flight object which has a flight information, right? Which has a flight number, departure time, arrival time, so on. So we can consider flight as an object, right? So in the response, currently we don't have anything defined. So let's add the flight information. Let's define what exactly user will get and what will be the type of each parameter. So let's define the type. So let's start with the flight information. So we have user will get the flight information. So let's define a type called flight, and the type of the flight is object. It has a list of some properties inside a flight object, right? So it has a flight number, departure date, time, so on. We just copied the flight information. So now let's define the type of each parameter. Flight number will be string, the date will be string, empty seats, this should be a number. So based on the requirement, you can define the type of each property. There should be a space, otherwise we will get an error. So we have created a flight data type. User will get flight information and also booking information. So let's copy the example, and here we can see in the response we get array of flight information, and each item in the array will have flight and PNR information, right? So we have defined the type for flight. So let's add the information related to the response. It's an array of items, right? Each item in the array will have flight and PNR information. So flight. So if you see the response, we have flight and also PNR information. So flight data type we have created. So let's use a custom data type that we have defined just now. Let's use flight. So we have PNR It's an array of PNR information, array of booking information. So in the response, we get flight and PNR information. So in the response, we can see that the default values are reflecting. If we change the data type, that will reflect in the documentation section. So flight will have the flight information and PNR will have array of booking information. So let's add the example that matches the data type, right? We have an example in the response, so let's add it here. Let's align it properly. We are getting an error because I think the data type that we have defined and the example is not matching. As a response, it should have array of flight and PNR. And if we see both the parameters are required. But if we see the response, we in the first item in the array, we just have flight information. We don't have the PNR information, right? That's the reason it's giving an error, because PNR is a required parameter, right? If we make it optional, we don't see the error because PNR is an optional parameter. If you don't have the booking information for some flight, you don't have to supply it because it's an optional field. So now the response, the example response that we are giving and the data type is matching. So currently the example that we have given is in JSON. So let's convert it to YAML. So we get a JSON to YAML converter, and we just have to copy the JSON and we will get the converted response in YAML. So let's just copy the response and paste it here as an example. Yes, it's working. So we use hyphens to indicate an array. So we can see we have array of PNR information and also array of flight information. So yes, so it's totally, we just have get flights API, just one API, but the root file looks huge just for one API, right? We have the response information, example, data type, everything in the root file. If we want to organize, we can create a data type file, example files, resource types, traits, so on. Based on if you have the common section repetitive in the root file, you can create a traits and resource types and organize the code. For now, let's create a data type file and move the flight data type outside. So we have created flight data type and just copy the flight information. It's of type object, and we have some properties for flight object. And in the documentation section, we can see the properties information. Now we have moved the data type outside. So let's import the data type file here. Let's copy the example as well and create a new file and move the example information. Let's select file type example, and it's a flights example. This way we can create files and organize the code so that the root file will look clean when we have multiple APIs created. So we just copied pasted the example here. Let's align it. Shift tab. Now we have moved the example outside, so let's import the example file. We'll use include tag to import the file. Now we can see that we have moved the example outside and importing it here, and similarly the data type. So we have created a get flights API with query parameters and also the response. We have defined the type of the input, the query parameters, and also the response information, right? Currently we just have the success response, but for any API we can expect the error codes 500, 404, the bad request, so on. So let's add bad request as well. application JSON. The response will be in JSON, and let's add some example for the bad request. We can add error code and also the message. Currently we just have the 400 response, and if you want to add multiple error response, you can add 401, 500, so on. If you have repetitive codes, you can create resource types as well. For now we just have 400 for getFlights API. If you want to add more APIs under the same resource, you can just keep on adding the HTTP methods under the same resource. And for now we are just concentrating on the getFlights API. So we have added the request information and also the response that we can expect as part of this API, right? We have added the detailed information of the response. We get flight information and also the array of PNR information. So the API is ready to publish. Now let's publish the API specification to Exchange. And once the API is published to Exchange, it will be available for API consumer and other developers, stakeholders, so that they can come and understand the behavior of the API. And also they can use API console and test the API behavior. So it's published to Exchange. So we have not tried to test the API from the API console. So we have an option, try it. We can test the API and check the behavior of the API, right? We have, if we don't give the required field, then we will get an error. So this is working based on the API specification. So all the fields are required. So, and we have given everything. So we are getting success response. So in the Exchange, we can see that API portal is created. And let's go to summary, and here we can find the all the APIs available. And flights data type will have the information of the flight and all the properties available inside the flight data type. And in the getFlights API, we can see we have query parameters, and in the response we get flight information. Here also we can test the API. So here we are testing the API by using mocking service. It's a feature given by Anypoint platform, which we can use to test the API to understand the behavior of the API. So if we copy the same link to Postman, it will expect you to give the proper header information. Otherwise we will get a 401. So if you want to access the same API from Postman, you can get the public URL for the mocking service. Just select this option, make it public, and get the URL. So just replace the base URL till flight. Just remove everything and just use the public URL here. And try to hit the API. Here we get the success response. Based on the example that we have given, we are getting the response. So if we don't give the required parameter, we will get an error, bad request. This is based on the API specification that we have defined. So this way we can test the API from Postman as well. For this we have to use a public URL for mocking service. Let's go to Exchange and check the API that we have published. So this currently we are in the API portal, and if you go to assets list or to Exchange, we can find this API in our organization. So where we have published. So this is the same API that we are going to import from Anypoint Studio and create the API. To create Mule project, we need Anypoint Studio IDE, and we can get this from Anypoint platform homepage. Just click on download and you will get a zip file from where you can extract the Anypoint Studio to some folders, something like this. And now let's click on Anypoint Studio application. we need to select a workspace. So based on where you want to save all your project, you can select the folder and select the workspace, and let's launch the application. So we are going to use this API specification and create the Mule project. So this is the API that we are going to use to create the Mule project. There are many ways using which you can create a project. So we can download a RAMl file and use it for the project creation. Or you can connect to Design Center and select the API specification and create the Mule project. Or we can connect to Exchange also and select the API specification for project creation. So currently we have opened Anypon Studio. Let's click on create a Mule project. Let's name it as Flights API IMPL. And here there are many ways you can get API and create the project. So you can import a file. If you have downloaded the RAMl file, you can just upload it here and create the project. Just browse the file and add it here. And another way is we can directly connect to the Design Center. Just use your login information and connect to Design Center. And we can connect to Exchange also. And another way is we can use Maven dependency. We can add the Maven dependency and create the project. So in this session, let's start using the Maven dependency and create the project. So I have just copied the default information. So let's add the information related to the project. So this is the artifact name and we have the group ID. So let's copy this information and create dependency informations. Project name is the group ID. Sorry, artifact ID. And the version is 1.0.0. So based on which version is the latest, you can select the version. Currently 1.0.0 is the latest version. Along with this information, we have to add the type and the classifier information also. So this should be zip and classifier should be RAMl. So now we have added the dependency information. Click on OK and the dependency should get added. Here we can see the information of the dependency getting added, but here we don't see that. Maybe because I have not connected to the Anypon platform. I think I have removed all the accounts. So let's go to the login page and connect to Anypon platform. So now you can see that I have not connected. I don't have account added. So let's add the account and connect to Anypon platform. So after giving the username and password, we'll come to the Design Center. From here you can select the API and create the project. But for now, let's not select any API. So we have connected to Anypon platform. Now let's add the same dependency information again. So let's add the dependency information, the group ID, artifact ID information, and the classifier should be RAMl. The type is zip. And click on OK. Yeah, now we can see that now we got the API specification that we were looking. So based on the dependency information that we have added, we got the API specification. So this is what we are going to use and create the Mule project. So click on finish. It takes some time to create the project, so let's wait for some time. Now we are creating the project based on the API specification that we have created, right? So yeah, the project is created and there is a Mule configuration file where we can see the flows. We have a main flow and the flow that is related to the API, the get flights API. So in the package explorer, we have POM file with all the dependencies and also a configuration file, right? This is like an interface. This is created based on the API specification and has exact same name as that of API specification. So let's rename it as interface, and we will have to keep this clean because every time we regenerate the flows, there will be a new flows created. So every time we add a new API, so this will be regenerated. So in the main flow, we have API kit router along with the error handlers. So API kit router will take care of routing the inbound request to that particular flow, right? So we just have get flights API, just one API. So the flow is created for that. So API kit router will take care of routing the inbound request to this flow. So if we go to the POM file, here we can see the dependency information that we have added, the RAMl file, RAMl information, the dependency that we have added. Yeah, the dependency is reflecting here. If you want to refer to the different version, you can change it here anytime. So let's just run the project as it is. We have not done any changes as of now. So let's run the project and see what we get as a response. The flows are created based on the API specifications. If we check the listener configuration, it's listening to HTTP port 8080. Yeah. We have 3 tabs: message flow, configuration XML, and also global elements. In the XML, all the flows that we can see in the message flow are represented in XML, and global elements will have the configuration information, like the configuration details of listener, to which port actually it's listening. All that information will be present in the configuration file. And also in the listener, we have a base path defined by default. /API is the base path, so that we have to give in order to access the APIs. So the application is deployed successfully. So this is the API that we have created, so that information still remains as it is. So currently, as per the configuration details we have seen, it's listening to the local host, and let's use the same API information, the API that we have created as part of API specification, right? It's listening to the port, but if we check the listener base path, it's /API. We have the API as base path, so we have to give that information as well, and it's listening to 8081 port. So we are getting the information based on the API specification. We have given the example, so we are getting the same example. So it doesn't matter what origin or destination we give, we get the same response. But if we don't pass the required parameter, then we will get a bad request error, right? Because all the 3 input parameters are marked as required in the API specification. So if we don't give, we will get a bad request. So otherwise we will get 200 success response, but the response that we are getting is just the example that we have defined in the API specification, right? API kit router, we have a console which will have the documentation for the APIs, and API kit router will route the flows inbound request to the particular flows. In this case, we just have one flow, but there can be multiple flows based on the API or based on the API specification. So you can, okay, we just have get flights, and if we check the transfer message here, the payload is exactly same as the example that we have given in the API specification, right? If we check the console, we get the documentation information for APIs, and in the response we just have the flight information as per the examples that we have defined. So this is a payload that we are getting as a response. If we change the payload to something else, we will get that as a response. Let's change the payload to hello world and we'll try to run the project. Just to save it, it's already working on the deployment. So the application is deployed, and if we try to run the API, now we will get hello world as a response. Previously we had a payload based on the example that we have defined in the API specification, but we changed it to hello world. So if we don't give the required parameter, we will get a bad request, but it doesn't actually says which parameter is not given, right? In that case, we can go to the listener and change the response information. In success response, we get payload, right? What payload we used to set, right? This is the payload we were setting. So the same payload we were getting as part of success. If we go to the response tab, we can see which information we will get as part of success or error. So in case of error, let's change it to error dot some description, error description. Previously it was payload, right? The payload were based on the default error handlers that we got as part of API specification. Now let's read the error description. So this error message will let us understand what exactly is going wrong. In this case, destination is not specified, so we are getting that as an error message. So in case of success, we are getting the payload that we have overridden. Yeah, we have not done any implementation. We just imported the API specification and running it. The flows are also got generated based on the specification. And if you want to add more flows, more APIs to the API specification, you can do the API changes and publish the latest version to Exchange and start consuming it from the project. In this case, let's see what we have done. We have defined the request and response information as part of API specification, right? We are getting the flight information and PNR array. But the flight information that we are getting is based on the example, but that is not the real implementation. But if you want to get the flight information, we have a REST API which gives the flight information based on origin, destination and departure date. So, and also PNR information we will get from the database. If we check the REST API information, it basically takes origin, destination, departure date as an input, and that is the same input is applicable for DB call as well. The REST API will need departure date, destination and origin to call the REST API. So when we call the REST API, we will get flight information. At the end, we have to consolidate both REST API output and the database output, DB call output, and finally we will get the output in the form that we have defined in the API specification. So currently we have not done any implementation, so we are not getting the flight information based on the origin, destination and departure date, right? Even if we give the random destination or origin, we still get the same payload because we have not yet worked on the implementation. In order to get the flight information, we have a REST API which is currently deployed in Cloud Hub. So this gives us the flight information. So it takes departure date, origin, destination as input, and it gives the flight information based on the query parameters. So from Bangalore to Mumbai, if we try to get the flight information, we get the list of flights. We have a lot of flights available for this origin and destination, so we get all the information. Based on the input that we give, we will get the flight information. So this is the REST API that we are going to use. If you change the origin destination information, you will get a flight information for that particular input. So we are going to use this REST API by passing these information, departure date, origin and destination, and gets the flight information. So this is the REST API that we are going to use and get the flight information. So currently we just have the transfer message, and the payload was just something hello world that we have hard coded. So let's remove it and create a new Mule configuration file. So this is a new configuration file that we are creating to call the REST API to get the flight information. Right? Get flights from internal API. We have an API which gives us the flight information. So it gives lot of information, just not the information that we want. So from Mule palette, we can select HTTP connectors, pre-built connector, which we can use to call the REST API. Let's use HTTP request and set the configuration. This is the connector, and we have, let's name it as call flights API. We'll have to give the configuration information so that the connector will know which API to call based on host, port, and the path information. So it's a HTTPS, and host will be, let's copy the information, the REST API information. This is the host information. We don't have port, right? We don't have port. So other fields, let's leave it as default. Here we can see that the API is getting built based on the information that we are giving. This is a get API. So HTTP method is get, and path is flights /flights. And we have the query parameters, right? We have to give the query parameters also. Let's go to query parameters and add the query parameters that we need to call this API. That is date to indicate the departure date of a flight. Let's add one by one. It's key value based. Origin is the key and the value is the value for that origin field. For now let's hard code some values and see if it works fine with the hard coded values, and later we can read it from the input. We'll add destination also. We'll try to get the flight information from Bangalore to Goa. And we have date, the departure date for a flight. (2022) 10 and 10. So now we have all the information that we need to call the API, and as a response we get payload. The response from the API will be part of the payload. So we will just print the payload as it is and see what we get by calling the flight's internal API. We have a REST API which gives the flight information, and we are going to use that API to get the flight information. So we have created a new flow. So we have to use a flow reference and start refer to that flow. This is like calling a function. So from flow reference we can tell which exact flow we want to refer. It's a internal API call. So flow name is it is just like a function. We just want to call this flow. As soon as we get the request for get flights, there will be a flow reference which will navigate the call to the internal API. where internal API flow where we are actually calling a REST API to get the flight information. So at the end we are printing the payload. So let's wait for the deployment. So the application is deployed successfully. Now let's go to the API and run it. So now we are getting different payload, right? We are calling a REST API. If we change the destination value from Goa to Mumbai, we still get Goa, because while calling the REST API, we have hard-coded the query parameters. We just gave Bangalore to Goa. So based on that, we are getting the input. If you want to read the values from input, okay, currently we are getting a payload as it is, right? So we get the input, query parameters, header parameters as part of attributes. And if you are not sure where those are available, you can just add a transfer message. I usually check this way. If I'm confused about the capital letters or small letters, just add a transfer message to the flow in the interface, because this is auto generated flow, so it will identify what will be the input. So we just added the transfer message to the flow that was auto generated. Here we can see in the query parameters we have origin, destination and departure date, and that is part of attributes, right? We don't have any payload. So if you want to add the payload, you can just select the type of the payload. It can be text, JSON or something. We have query parameters, that is part of attributes. If we refer query parameters dot attributes dot query parameters, then we will get those information. We have header parameters, query string, so on. If you are confused which one to use, you can just cross check. If you are new, you can come here and cross check, or you can debug and check what will be there as part of attributes. So now let's stop the application and do the changes to the input. So before making the changes, there is another way. You can just debug and see what will be there as part of attributes. This you can do only if you are not sure where you get query parameters or header parameters. Otherwise it's not required. You can directly access the attributes, the query parameters, just by using the names. But for now, let's debug and see what we will get in the attributes and how to see the input information. Now we can see that we have attributes, and if you check, we have query parameters, origin, destination and departure date. If you want to cross check how to access them, you can just use this expression and try to access the parameters. Attributes query parameters dot origin, that will give the information that we are passing as part of origin. That's a input, right? That's the query parameter that we are passing to call the API. If you want to get the destination information, you can get it. So this is how you can get the information from the input that we are passing. You can use this as a input to call the REST API. For now we have hard coded the information, right? Okay, let's stop the application and do the changes. Now we got to know where we get the inputs, how we can access the attributes, right? How we will get the origin, destination and departure date. So let's try to access it through attributes. This will have header parameters also. destination and departure date. Okay, now we are getting the input and we are using those inputs to call the REST API. Now we don't have the hard-coded values, so based on the input that we give, we should get the response accordingly. Okay, the application is deployed. Now we should be able to get the response based on the input that we give. So let's call for Bangalore to Mumbai. We are getting it right. For Bangalore to Mumbai, we are getting the response. So, and if we change to Goa, we should get for Bangalore to Goa. So now the values are not hard coded. So we are reading these query parameters. We are reading origin, destination, attributes and using it to call the REST API. If we give some wrong destination, we get the response from the REST API that the flights are not found for this destination. So now it's working based on the input that we are passing as part of query parameters. So now we have seen how to read these attributes. You can check these from transfer message, or you can also debug and see how to access these inputs and start using it in the project. So this is the response we should get as per the API specification. So, but if you check the response that we are currently getting, this is the response that we are getting from the REST API. We are getting lot of information for each flight, right? We have a lot of information, but we don't need all this information. If we check the API specification that we have created, we want to expose the consumer some limited fields, not everything. So we just need flight number, departure date, departure time, arrival time, so on. The empty seats that are available, right? We need to expose the API consumer some limited fields, not everything that we are getting as part of internal API. So currently we are calling the REST API based on the departure date, origin and destination and getting the input. But that input has lot of information, so we have to do the mapping to get the limited fields. So this is the response that we are getting, right? This has lot of information. So we can do the response mapping to get the required fields, right? We are currently getting exactly what we are getting in the REST API. So because we are just printing the payload, we have not done any mapping on top of this payload. So we can do the coding here in the Dataweave and get the information needed. For example, this is an array of flight information, right? If we check the payload, so this is the response that we have copied. So flights will have array of flight information. So let's try to get the first item in the array. Flights will have array of information. So let's just get the first element from the array. This is how you can do the mapping here directly in the transfer message, and if you're comfortable doing it here, you can do the mapping and directly extract the information you needed. So now we are getting the information of first flight. Previously we were getting the array of information, but now we just get the information of first flight, right? You can do the mapping this way from transfer message in Dataweave 2, right? Here you can do the you can do the response mapping and get the response in the format which you want, right? This is the payload that we want to do the mapping to get the limited fields related to the flight. So let's go to the Dataweave playground. If you are comfortable doing it in the transfer message, you can directly do the mapping. If you are not comfortable, you can always come to the playground and do the changes. So we got the response from the REST API, right? We called the REST API to get the flight information based on the query parameters, origin, destination, and the departure date of a flight. So we are getting a flight information. Actually, we are getting a lot of information for each flight, but we don't need everything to be given to the API consumer. So we have to do the mapping and expose the limited information. So we just have to give some 6-7 fields to the API consumer, not everything. So we can do this response mapping from IDE, from Anypoint Studio, or from transform messages. So we can just extract the information of a flight, for example, flight number, arrival airport, arrival time, departure date, departure time, and also we can get the available seats. So this way we can extract the information and build the response for a flight. So instead of doing it from the IDE, so this is an interactive playground where we can do the response mapping here, because the left side we have a payload. We just copied the response from the REST API, right? This is the response that we have copied. We have flights information, so we have copied the exact same response. The left side we pasted the payload, and in the middle we can write the script, right? We have flights, so flight will have 4 flight information, right? Payload dot flights. Payload is just everything that we got from the REST API. So let's try to extract the information that we need, right? We have airport codes, we have lot of information related to the flight. So we just we will extract what we needed. So payload dot flights, and we will use map object. We are not getting map option because there is a difference. If we have array, we will get map option. So this is not an array, this is object. So flight object. So we are going to do the mapping, so we'll use map object. We have value, key, and index as a parameter. Value is the information of each element. So the information that presents inside the first element is represented as a value, right? That BLR, and that is a key. The value which is inside is a value, and index will be 0, right? If you check the key, this is the key we get, right? It's a key value pair. Index is just the representation of the index. So the value, the content that is present inside is a value, right? So we have to extract the information from the value, not from index or key. So first we need flight number. So let's see the API specification, because it's a skeleton to indicate what exactly should be given to the API consumer, right? So we have flight information. So flight will have flight number. So this as a new field, this is some test field which is not required. So let's copy the flight information and add it here. So we need this much of information for each flight, right? So we have to extract this information from the flight. So let's give some name, flight. So flight will have few properties: flight number, departure information, arrival information, so on. So we can extract the flight number from value, right? From map object, we have seen that the value represents the content inside each element. So value will have flight information as well, right? Value dot flight will give the flight information. So let's try to extract the flight number. Value dot flight number. It's null. It's null because I think something spelling mistake. It should be flights. It's a flights, right? Value dot flights dot flight number. Now we can see that we are getting a flight number. So departure date also will be present inside a flight. So for now, let's replace all the hard-coded values with null. And later we will extract the information and do the proper mapping. Okay. Now we just extracted the flight number. So for each element, it is picking the flight number from flights object. Right, where is the departure information? Inside a flight, we have departure, and inside departure we have airport name, we have departure date, departure time, everything. So in this case, we just need the departure date. Value dot flights dot departure, departure end, and what was it? It was date, right? It's a date. So we got the date. Similarly, we need the origin information, from which airport it's starting, from which airport it's departing. So value dot flights, departure, then airport name, right? It's a airport name. We are basically going through each object and extracting the information that we want to expose to the API consumer, right? We got the origin information, and similarly let's get destination information as well. Destination will be there in arrival airport name, and we have arrival date, arrival time as well. Yeah, we got destination as well, and we need to get the empty seat, right? We don't get empty seats directly. We have total number of seats and filled seats, so we can subtract the total from already filled seats so that we will get empty seats, right? Let's do the calculation. Value dot flights dot seats total, right? Total we are getting. So let's subtract with already filled values. Yeah, now we are subtracting the total number of seats with the filled seats. So we are getting the available empty seats. And we have to give departure time information as well, which is present inside departure and time, right? Departure dot time will give the departure time. Yeah, we got the departure time, and also similarly we have to get arrival time as well, arrival time for flight. Yeah, flight dot arrival dot time will give the arrival time. Yeah, so now we got the flight information just like how we have expected in the API specification. So we are matching exactly the same properties that were expected as part of flight information. So now we are getting a flight, right? Let's so we are getting flight information, right? Flight, and each flight will have flight information. So but we actually should get array of flight and along with the booking. So let's try to give the information that actually matches the API specification. So let's wrap it inside parentheses and get flight. So this will give just one flight information, but we want array of flight information. Right, so now we are getting array of flight information, right? Previously we were getting flight and respective flight information. Now we are getting array of flight information, right? Yeah, previously this was the response we were getting. Now we are getting array of flight information. So you can do some trial error here. If you want the response in different format as an object or as an array, you can do the mapping here, and you can just copy the response. So here we can see we have a flight information represented by flight, and PNR represented by PNR array represented by PNR. So let's add flights. Let's wrap the flight information inside flights. So now we are getting flight, right? We are getting array of flight information, and the flight information is specifically wrapped as a flight information. So, and also we have PNR array. Let's move it inside, and we should get PNR. Let's say it's empty array for now, because currently I'm trying to match the response that we have in the API specification. This is how we have the response in the API specification. So let's copy the script and paste it in the transfer message. If you're comfortable doing it in the transfer message, you can do the mapping here directly. But I feel comfortable doing it using the interactive playground, where we can do the mapping and check the response. And if it's matching exactly what we are expecting, then we can copy paste here. So let's build the application. Let's deploy the application. Yeah, it's deployed, and now we are getting the response as expected. Now we are trying to get the flight information from Bangalore to Mumbai. If you change to Goa, you should be able to get different response, right? So now we are getting the response exactly as mentioned in the API specification. So, but we are for now we are not getting the PNR information, booking information, but we are calling the internal flights API to get the flight information. So we have a internal API which gives us the flight information. So we are taking the input attributes and passing as an input to the REST API. So, and once we get the payload, we are doing the response mapping. We did use interactive playground and did the mapping and got the response. We got the flight information. We are taking input, calling the REST API, and we got the flight information after the mapping. So now we have to get the booking numbers. So we have to call a database by using a input, origin, destination, and departure date, and give the PNR information in the response. So this is the response mapping we did. So we did extract the information from our flights and mapped it to the fields, mapped it to the flight information. So currently we have empty PNR array, but we can get those information from the database. So I have this information, booking information, available in the database MySQL. So here you can see that based on the departure date, origin, and destination, there are some bookings for flights, right? if we try to select available booking based on the origin, destination and departure date, we get the list of bookings, right? There are many flights available for this departure and origin, and we have list of bookings, right? From Bangalore to Mumbai, we have list of flights and also a lot of bookings done for these flights. So we can call this query and get the information. So from AnyPoint Studio, we just need connection information in order to establish connection with the MySQL server. So these are the connection information that we have used to connect to the MySQL server. So for now, we just have REST API, right? We got the flight information, but we yet to get the booking information. So let's stop the application and let's get the booking information from a database. So let's from Mule palette we can use DB connectors. We have pre-built database connectors which we can use to run the SQL queries. For now, let's use a select database connector because we are going to get the information from the database based on origin, destination and departure date. We are using this database call to get the booking information. So we need to give a connector configuration. I am trying to connect to MySQL database, so MySQL connection it is, and we need a JDBC driver as well. Just add the dependency. So this dependency will be added to this project. You can check the dependency getting added in the POM file. So let's give the connection information. Currently it's in a localhost. The server is running in local system, localhost, and port is 3306. And just give username and password that you have set to connect to MySQL server. So these are the connection information that we need to connect to a database. The connection is successful. So we did establish a connection to the database successfully. Right? Now we have to call the query. We have to get the flight information. And from there we can extract the booking information for each flight. Okay, this is the query that we are going to call from Mulesoft. As a input, we have to give origin, destination and departure date. Right? We are getting this information as a query parameter. Right? We are going to use it and get the booking information. So we just copied the query and we need to pass in input parameters, right? We have to give the origin information. So that we know, right? We get it from as part of attributes query parameter. So let's get the input information from attributes and use it here in the query. We get destination information as well from attributes. Similarly, the departure date. These are the input parameters. Now colon and the name of the input parameter. It's a origin, right? So this way we can pass the input parameter to the query, colon and the name of the input parameter, and this is colon and d date it is. Okay, we did mapping for flight information, right? We are getting the flight information. For now, let's remove the mapping that we did and just print the payload. Let's see what we will get. We have removed the payload, right? We have removed the script that we did we used for a response mapping, the flight's response mapping. So I just copied and have a backup. So currently we are printing the payload as it is. Whatever the response that we get from the database, we are trying to print the information as it is. So the application is deployed. Let's see what we get as a response. So we are not getting the response, right? Let's change the departure date. No. There must be something wrong in the query, maybe. We are getting the query parameters. We are extracting the input from the query parameters and adding it to the query, right? So we are not sure what input we are passing, right? So let's try to print the input that we are passing to the query. Output application JSON. Let's print exactly these are the information that we are passing to the query, right? These are the input parameters for query. So let's try to print these values and see what we are getting and why we are not getting the response. Let's wait for deployment. So this is the exact response, exact input that we are passing, right? But we are not getting the response. So there must be something wrong in the way we are querying. So okay, the application is deployed and we are still not getting, because if you check the input that we are passing to the query, all the parameters are null. Origin, destination, departure date, everything is null. That's why we are not getting the response. Okay, now let's add the breakpoint and see why we are not getting origin, destination information. Because as of now we are getting all these parameters as null, so we are not getting any response from the database as well. So if you see any problem or if something is not working as expected, just debug and see the input that you are getting, the attributes, payload. Sometimes the payload will be overridden and attributes will be overridden. So in that case, you won't get the result as expected. So the application is deployed. So let's run the API again. Okay. We have attributes, headers, we have query parameters, right? We are in the first call, we have the query parameters as expected, but when it comes to database, okay, we don't have query parameters, right? The attribute information is already overridden. So in the first REST API call, we had all the information, but after getting the response, the attribute information that we had has already been overridden by something else, right? That's why we were not getting the origin destination information. That's why we were not able to get anything from the database, because all the information, all the input values that we have given to the query were null. You can see that we have origin destination departure date as null. So it's better always when you have the input like header parameters, query parameters, or it can be anything, you just save it as a variable, input variables. So let's initialize input variable so that they will be available till the end of the flow. So let's create a variable for the query parameters. Origin, let's name, you can name whatever you want, and save attribute information as a variable so that it will be available. Let's create variable for other two parameters as well. So it's always recommended to create a variable, initialize variable as soon as you get some input as part of query parameters or header parameters or something. Departure date. Yeah, now we have initialized, but we don't need the payload because this is a get API call and we will not pass any payload, right? We are not passing any payload. We just have the query parameters. So for all the three query parameters, we have created a variables, and we can use, you can change the values. You can directly start using vars dot origin, vars dot destination, so on. So we have created variables, right? So let's try to access the information through variables. Vars let's replace logger information as well. And also it's always recommended to create the flow for each API call. If you have internal API, create a subflow for it. If you have database call, create a subflow for that particular database. And also it's always good to log input before calling the API and the response after calling the API. So that way it will be useful for helpful for debugging. Okay, we are still not getting the response. Let's check the logger. Here we can see departure date is null because the variable name that we gave is ddate, not departure date, right? So let's save it. Okay, now we are getting the response from the database. We are getting the array of flight information, right, along with the booking. Okay. We are getting a payload, right? We are printing the payload as it is. So for REST API call also we are getting payload, and for DB call also we are getting payload. In that case, at the end, whatever will be the latest payload, that will be printed, right? Because for get flights API REST API call also we had payload. For DB call also we have payload, right? So the latest payload will be written at the end. So we'll save the payload as a booking information. So the payload will not be overridden in that case. Now we are saving the booking information, the response from the DB call as a booking information. So let's access through variables vars.bookinginfo. This should print the response from the database. Otherwise the payload will be overridden. Now the REST API will return payload, and booking info will be the response from DB, right? So we are getting the response as expected. Okay, we did mapping for flight information, right? We did the mapping and got the flight information needed. So let's create a variable, and I just pasted the response that I got from the database. So this is the payload that we got, so I'm just creating a variable for it. Okay, previously we did mapping for flight information, so we just add one payload. Now we have a payload for PNRs as well, right? So let's create a variable for one payload and save it, and another payload we can have left side. So let's copy the flight information to a temp payload. So just name as some variable. So now we have a temp payload which has the response from the internal flight API, right? So temp payload we are using to do the mapping, so we are getting the output response as expected, right? We have flight information and PNR. PNR is anyways empty because it's a hard-coded value. So the left side payload, let's replace with the response that we are getting from the database. So we are getting array of flight information and booking information, right, based on origin and destination. Now we are getting flight information but not PNR information. So we have flight number, right? For each flight object we have a flight number. So there can be few bookings for each flight number, and we have to do the mapping in order to get the bookings for that particular flight, because we don't want to get all the bookings that are done for the flights, right? We don't want to mix the bookings. We have to get the booking for that particular flight number. So payload is the array of booking information. So since it's an array, we are going to use map, not map object, right? It's an array of information. We have 13 flight informations. So let's use map. Each item will represent the element, and index will have will represent the index of each element. So PNR we will get from item.pnr, right? Item will represent the element inside the first element, first index. So item.pnr will give the PNR information. So at the end we will just extract PNRs. So now we are getting an array of PNR, but we haven't done the filtering, so we are getting all the bookings that are done, right? We have, I think, 13 PNRs, but we haven't actually did the filtering based on the flight number. We have 13 bookings. So all the 13 bookings are present for all the flights, but that is not the case, right? Because flight number 1 may not have all the 13 bookings. It can have just 2-3 bookings done for that flight. So let's do the filtering. Filter based on the flight number. Item dot flight number, and also flight number is present here also as a value from the previous payload that we have used, right? The flight payload. From there we have to match. Now we are getting the PNRs that are matching, that are present for that particular flight number. Let's copy the flight number and search in the payload. Let's see the count. We just have one. We just have one booking, right? So in the PNR list we just have one booking number. So in this case we have 4 and all the 4 are reflecting. So this way you can cross check. So we have 4 information, 4 bookings again, and those are present in the PNR array. So we are taking the payload and filtering based on the flight number and getting the array of flight information. So we are extracting the PNRs as an array. Otherwise we will get the response in different format. So that's why interactive playground is good, so that you can see the response and do the trial error and make sure that you are getting the response in the format which you are expecting. So this is the response that we are expecting, right? When you have multiple payloads and want to do the mapping, then you can save those as a variables and do the mapping. Okay, now let's copy the script and add it in the transfer message. We don't have the temp payload here, right? It's a payload. This is the payload from the REST API. And the booking information is represented as a booking info, right? It's not a payload because we renamed and saving the response as a booking info. So let's access that information as vars.bookinginfo. Okay, now we have completed the response mapping. So, okay, the application is deployed. Let's run the application and see what we get. Okay, we are getting the response as expected, right? We are getting the PNR information along with the flight information. So let's change the destination to different, Bangalore to Mumbai. Yeah. For this, we just have 2 flights and we are getting the, okay, we can check in the JSON viewer. We just have 2 flights available for Bangalore to Mumbai. And this was the API specification, and this was an example, and the response that we are getting now is matching the API specification. So we called a REST API to get the flight information, and also we did call database and got the booking information, and we did filtering based on the flight number, so that the bookings will reflect for that particular flight. You can still work on fixing the negative scenarios if you have not given the proper name for destination. You can do the validation. For now, if we give some random value for destination, number, special characters, we are getting different error. If you want to avoid these kind of errors in the API specification, actually you can do the pattern validation and avoid the user from giving these kind of junk values. So when we do the pattern validation, user cannot even give some special characters or numbers or something. You can always restrict it from the API specifications. Okay, in this case, if we check the get flights API, this is the API specification we have given. If you just give one letter or special characters or anything, it works, right? If you give numbers also, it works, because we haven't done any validation for this field, right? It should be, the expectation is that it should be a string. There was no other validation. But if you want to do the validation, you can add the pattern, you can add the regular expression and set some constraint. You can do the pattern validation. It should be, for example, it should be capital letters from A to Z. Yeah. It should be a capital letter from A to Z. So no special characters, numbers allowed in that. Right? If you have the parameter as a number, you cannot do this pattern validation, because this pattern validation is applicable for parameters of type string only. If you want to set the max length or minimum length, you can do it. If you're very sure that the origin destination codes will be a minimum of 3 length, then you can set that constraint as well. And if you want to allow small letters, that also you can define in the regular expression as a pattern. Okay, if you give small letters, numbers or special characters, it will give you an error. So there is a validation based on the pattern you have defined. So the API consumer must provide the input in the format that matches the pattern. Okay, let's see, this is the pattern validation that we want to do for input parameters. And let's publish the latest version to Exchange, so that we can see how to start referring to the new version from the project. Now the API, the latest versions are published. Latest version of API. Previously 1.0.0 was the version, and the latest is 1.0.1. When we created the project, it was 0.0. Let's update it to refer to the latest version. And also in the interface, we have to make changes to refer to the latest version. These are the two places you have to change, interface and also the POM, where you have added the dependency. Let's run the project again. Now it should be able to pick the latest changes that we have done to the API specification. And in the API specification, if you have new APIs added to the existing API specifications, then you can generate the flows also by updating the version. Now we are getting a different message. So now it's indicating that the value that is given for destination parameter is not valid, because there is a pattern validation, but it's not matching. So this way we can do the validation for the parameters. So we haven't done any changes in the project, but the validation is happening based on the API specification. So we have created the project by importing a API specification, and we call REST API. We did integration of a REST API and a database call, and giving the consolidated response. So we have created a get flights API. We are getting origin, destination, departure date as a request, and we have built the response where we are getting flight information and the booking information. So we are getting the flight information from a REST API and also booking information from the database call. So we are taking an input and integrating multiple systems, that is REST API and the database call, and we are giving the consolidated response to the API consumer. And for now, these REST API call and the database calls are sequential. First we are calling the get flights API and getting the payload, and next we are calling the database to get the booking information, and at the end we are doing a response mapping. But if you see the response of each call and the input, they are independent. The REST API call and the database call is independent of each other. So we are taking the same input to call the REST API and also the database. We just need origin, destination and departure date. So these two calls are actually independent of each other. So we can call them parallelly by using scatter gather component. So now let's see how to use a scatter gather component and call the REST API and the database call parallelly. So if we see the first picture, these calls are sequential. And in the second one, we are using scatter gather and calling the booking information and also the REST API parallelly. Now let's go to the Mule configuration file and do the changes. So before that, let's try to organize the code little bit because we have all the calls, all the API call. For example, we have API call and the database call, loggers, everything in one flow. So we can always create a subflow and segregate the API calls. So in the logger, we have a mistake actually. Previously, we were checking for departure date, but the variable is date. Let's change it. And when we create a subflow for some API call, it's good to have the loggers before calling the API and after getting the response, so that it will help during if we get any issues, it will help us in the debugging stage. So currently we have a response mapping for flights and also for booking information. So let's create subflow or to call the flight API. In subflows, we won't get error handling. Like in the flow, we will get the error handling, but in subflows, we don't get it. So since these API calls are related, we are going to have a subflows in the same configuration file. So let's add the, okay. We are initializing the input variables. So the query parameters that we are getting are initialized, and we are getting those as part of the variables, and then we are printing the input. And before calling the REST API, let's add a logger to indicate that we are going to call a API with this information. For example, we are going to call the flight API for this flight number or for this origin, destination, so on. So it will give more information while debugging. Getting flight information for now, I'll just add origin. But if you need the proper message, then you can add a destination and the date as well. So this is something to indicate that we are going to call API. So this is before calling the API, before calling the REST API. So after getting the response, let's have one more logger and let's print the payload. Select fx, so expression. So this payload is before transformation. Let's name the subflow get flights it is, and let's create one more subflow to have the database call. This is to get the booking information. And in this also we can add a logger before the database call and after getting the response from the DB. Getting booking information for the flight. Now let's add the database call and again the logger to print the response that we are getting from the database. It is not a payload. So if you remember, we are saving the response in the variable name, right? Okay, if we check the response, what we are getting from the database call, we are saving the payload in a variable called a booking info. So let's let's print the booking information. So now we have created subflows, one to call the REST API and another one for database call. So now from the initial flow, we can add a flow reference and start calling these subflows. From the first flow, we can call get flights. This is more like calling a function. So, and okay, it's taking time to save the changes. Okay, this flow reference is to get the booking information. Now let's build the application. We haven't done any changes. We have just organized the code. We have created subflows and calling the flows from the parent flow. Okay, the application is deployed successfully, and now we can test and see if we are getting the exact same response just like before. Okay, now we are getting for Bangalore to Mumbai, and we are getting PNR information as well. So if we change the input, we should get different response. Yeah, after organizing the code, we are getting the response as expected, right? Let's use word wrap and see if we are getting the log message as expected. We are getting booking information for the flight, and also we can see that we have array of flight and booking information. The response from the REST API is also printed above, so we are getting the log message as expected. Okay, now let's use scatter gather component and see how we can call the flows parallelly. And let's add the flow reference inside scatter gather. Yeah, after adding the flows inside scatter gather, there will be a route created for each flow. Here we can see we have routes inside scatter gather, and if you want to add a route, you can just edit the XML and you can add. If you want, you can add route and the flows. So we haven't changed much. We just used scatter gather and moved the existing flows inside the scatter gather. So as of now, we have a transfer message where we are doing the response mapping. So now let's stop the application, and we'll add a transfer message, and let's print the payload by using a new transfer message and see what exactly will be the payload after this scatter gather, what payload we get. Let's check that. Okay, let's just print the payload. So after executing scatter gather, we should be able to get a payload, right? Let's see what payload we will get after completing this scatter gather, and after completing these two flows, what will be the payload. Now the application is deployed. So let's run the application and see what response we get. Okay, we have a debugger at the last transform message. So before that, we should be able to get the payload after running scatter gather component. So this is the payload that we are getting, right? We can copy this outside and see what exactly we are getting from after running these flows together, like parallelly. Okay, this is the payload that we are printing. We just have a transform message and added a payload, and we are just copying the payload that we are getting after executing the flows parallelly. So we have an array of 0 and 1. So, and in each item we can see the payload again. In the first item we don't have a payload, we have attributes, and in the second item in the array we have a payload. Right, in the second item we have a payload which has a flight information, because the second flow is related to a REST API, which is a internal API call to get the flight information. So second one is representing the flight information, the second item in the array, right? The first one is a DB call. So we can actually access these items like payload dot one, that will give the first element from first index. Yeah, this is the payload from first index, right? We have a flight information. If you want to get from 0th index, you can just use 0 and get the response. Okay, this is how we can actually access the first element from the array will give the flight information, and 0th element will have the booking information. It should have the booking information, but for now payload is empty. That is because previously we had made changes, and we are getting the payload as a variable. We are actually saving the payload in a variable, right? The response we get will be in a variable called booking info. That's why the payload currently is empty, right? The information will be part of a variable. If we check the variable, now we can see the response from the database, but it was not there as part of the payload that we got from scatter gather. That is because the information that we got from DB was saved into a variable called booking info. Now we have removed the variable, so we should get the payload with the booking information. Okay, now the application is deployed. Okay, previously we did not have any payload in the 0th element, because the booking information was saved in a variable, so it was not present as a payload. So now let's check what response we get, because we have removed a variable, and now we are getting now we should be able to get the payload. Okay, this is I think something is wrong. Its breakpoints are not hitting, so let's stop the application and start again. Okay, let's stop the application and start again. Okay, we have removed the variable, and now we should be able to get the payload for first element in the payload that we are getting after executing the scatter gather component. So let's check what we get. The application is deployed. Okay, we got the breakpoint. Let's just print the payload. Let's copy it to JSON viewer and see what we are getting for the database call. Now we can see that we have a payload. Previously we did not have a payload because the information was saved as part of a booking info variable. So we did not have a payload that time. So after removing the variable, we are getting a payload. So after executing the scatter gather component, we will get array of items. So each element represents the flow. The first one is for first route, and the second element will be for second route. So the payload of first element will represent the booking information, and second one is for the flight information. But we are not getting the response after executing after completing the flows. That is because we are directly trying to access the payload. But now it's not just payload. Now the payload will have it's an array basically based on the routes that you have. The first element, first index will have the information related to flight information. So let's try to access the payload from first index, payload.1 and then payload, and the same is applicable for booking information as well. That is as part of 0th element. Yeah, we made the changes. Previously we were just using the information directly from payload and the variable. Now we have changed that so that it can get the information from the payload that we are getting from scatter gather. Now we should be able to get the response as expected, the flight information and also the booking information. Yeah, the application is deployed successfully. And now we are getting the response. Right, we are getting the flight information and also the booking information. If we change the input, we should be able to get a different response. Yeah, now we are calling the REST API and the database call parallelly. Okay, now we have seen how to use scatter gather component and call and make the API calls parallelly. So now let's remove the transfer message where we just add the payload information, and that was just for debugging purpose. So just to check what payload we get after executing scatter gather component. If you want to add one more route, you can just, if you want to drag and drop some component, you can do that. Otherwise you can do the changes in XML as well and add the flow. Now let's just add some transfer message. So when we call the APIs parallelly, they will get executed parallelly, so that when we have the complex mapping, that will help us speed up the execution. In route 3, we just have a payload, right? So we will just print and see what we get from payload 3. Actually, this should be moved inside because we have flight, next PNR, and next is a payload 3 that we should be able to get from the route that we have added newly. Okay, let's run the API. Okay, the payload is null. Okay, we are building the payload. We should have got the message here, but we are getting a null response. Okay, let's add the transfer message again and see what payload we are getting. Okay, the application is deployed and let's see what payload we are getting. We should be able to get the new message that we have added as part of payload 3, but we are not getting. Let's check why. Okay, this should be part of element 2 because it starts from 0, right? 0, 1, 2. It should have been 2, not 3. Okay, now we should be able to get the response as expected. The application is deployed successfully. Let's go and check if we are getting the payload 3 from the new component that we have added in the scatter gather. Yes, we are getting the payload. So we have seen how to use a scatter gather and add the routes, multiple routes, and how to access the payload related to each route. So at the end we will get array of array. So basically payload will be an array, so you can access based on the routes that you want to get the information. And also we have added the log messages, so before calling the API and after getting the response, so that will help us do the debugging. So let's see, let's recall what we have done. We have imported the API specification and created the Mule project. So the main flow and console is created from the API specification, and also the flow is auto generated based on the specifications. So we have created a Mule configuration to get the flight information and also booking information. So we have created subflows to call the REST API and also for DB call. And we have used scatter gather and calling these API and DB parallelly, right? And also we have learnt the response mapping. We have used interactive Dataweave playground and did the response mapping. And in the global element, we can see the configuration information. If we see, everything is hard coded. The value, port, username, password, everything is hard coded, but which is not recommended. You can create a properties file and use it from properties file always. And also if you have confidential information like username, password, and always encrypt them and have them in a separate file, secure file, because there are algorithms that we can use for encryption. Okay. Now let's use the jar file. So currently we are in the project workspace where we have our project, and we are taking this jar file, and we'll see quickly how to deploy the application using jar file. We can go to runtime manager. You can use Maven commands to deploy the application, but for now we will just use a jar file and see how we can deploy the application. Okay, let's click on deploy application, and here you can give the name for the application and leave all the default values as it is. And we'll try to upload the jar file. Click on the jar file, select it. We'll leave all the default value as it is, and we'll try to deploy the application. We don't have any properties to add. If you have the properties, like if you have encrypted, you will have key, and if you have a property segregated based on the environment like stage, QA and all, you can give the environment properties as well. For now it's a simple application. We don't have any properties to be added, so we are just uploading the jar file and deploying the application. So we just have a sandbox, but you can have a stage, dev, prod, QA environments. So based on the environment where you want to deploy the application, you can select the environment. Now the application is successfully deployed, and we got the public endpoint. So this is what we are going to use to access the API. So currently this is hosted in Cloud App Server. So let's use this link and test our API. Okay, let's go to Postman and try to call the API. And the API base API information remains as it is. API flights is a resource, and all these are same. So let's copy and paste. Previously we were running in the localhost 8081 port, but now the same application is deployed in the Cloud App Server, and let's try to call the API and see what response we get. Now we will get an error because in the destination we are not matching the pattern validation. So this is a confirmation that the application is deployed successfully, because this is an error from the API specification, the pattern validation we did, right? We are not matching the pattern, we are getting an error. For now I'm not getting the success response. That is because my SQL server currently that I have used is running in my local system. It's a local host. So Cloud App Server will not know where the MySQL server is running. That's why we are not getting a success response in this case. So let's recall what we have learned. We have created the RAMl API specification and defined the input and output information, the skeleton for the API. And we have added the Maven dependency and created a Mule project by importing the API specification that we have created. And also we have used HTTP, DB and DB connector, and also scatter gather component. And also we did response mapping using Dataweave. We used Dataweave interactive playground, and also we deployed the application by using a jar file. So we were not able to get the success response. That is because MySQL server was running in my local system and it was not available for Cloud App Server. If you have everything, the API, database, everything that is available for Cloud App Server, you should be able to get successful response. That's it for today. Thank you.